Schönen guten Tag und hallo. Heute geht es natürlich um den Krieg im Nahen Osten, ein Thema, das uns wahrscheinlich die nächsten
Good day and hello. Today we are going to talk about the war in the Middle East.
dramatische Entwicklungen
This topic will probably occupy us in the coming weeks and months, as dramatic developments are emerging.
konnte.
I want to explain how this could happen and what we can expect from the conflict situation in the region.
Ich möchte zunächst
First, I want to say that the terrible events, the Hamas attack, the incursion into Israeli territory, and the death of at least 1,700 Israelis, including 200 kidnapped towards the Gaza Strip, are all terrible crimes.
Gazastreifen
These must be condemned. Nevertheless, I will refrain from a moralizing view in my analysis.
glaube ich mir trotzdem
I will try to explain the background of this conflict and discuss possible future developments.
versuchen,
It is important to me to make this clear from the beginning.
ist dieses
In Germany, we tend to divide the world into good and evil, especially when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
in Deutschland
This approach is also widespread in the Middle East, and I consider it very dangerous.
in Sachen
Therefore, I will refrain from a moralizing view, with one exception that is very important to me.
gefährlich. Ich werde also auf Moralisierung verzichten, mit einer Ausnahme, die mir sehr, sehr wichtig ist. Ich denke, dass unser Mitgefühl, unsere Anteilnahme, unsere Solidarität, unsere Empathie
I think that our compassion, sympathy, solidarity, and empathy should be directed towards innocent civilians.
gelten sollte,
These people, whether on the Israeli or Palestinian side, have been caught in this deadly conflict through no fault of their own.
Angehörige
They have been killed, leaving behind loved ones who are naturally beside themselves.
Tragödie, was hier
It is a terrible tragedy what is happening here. The actions of Hamas are to be condemned. Our solidarity and compassion are for the victims on both sides, as innocent people are dying in both Israel and Palestine.
auf Palästinenser
Now I would like to consider the matter itself. My views may not correspond to the prevailing mainstream in Germany, but precisely for that reason, they could be interesting and enriching. I am aware that in emotionally charged conflicts like the current one in the Middle East, different perspectives are possible.
natürlich auch darüber
Not everyone will share my views, but I would be satisfied if we could have a rational debate. Such a debate allows for a differentiated view of the conflict. This differentiation is essential. If we continue to divide the world only into good and evil, into black and white, we run the risk of finding ourselves in a war in the Middle East.
unerlässlich
And this war could be very dangerous.
Gefahr, in einem Krieg uns wiederzufinden im Nahen Osten, der wirklich sehr, sehr gefährlich werden könnte. Viele Kommentatoren haben diesen Überfall der Hamas auf israelisches Gebiet
Many commentators describe the Hamas attack on Israeli territory as an embarrassment for the Israeli army.
Thema
However, I do not want to delve further into this topic here.
diesen Überfall
The attack has often been compared to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001.
das ist
This comparison is problematic, as it gives the impression that it could once again be a war against terrorism, similar to the one the US waged after the attacks.
das ist nun
The problem with this is that we all know the consequences of this war on terror.
USA gemacht.
Over 1 million people were killed and there was devastating destruction in the Arab Islamic world.
Dieser
We hope that the parties involved in the Middle East, the Israelis and Palestinians, do not repeat this mistake made by the US.
Sondergleich
A purely moralistic view is problematic as it tends to take sides and divide the world into good and evil. US President Joe Biden stated after the terrorist attacks that what Hamas has done is comparable to the terrorist attacks of the Islamic State.
moralisierenden
He even added that Hamas fighters have raped women and beheaded babies.
seinen Ausführungen, dass die Hamas-Kämpfer Frauen vergewaltigt hätten und Babys geköpft hätten. Nichts ist unmöglich. Wer wollte ausschließen, dass die Hamas-Kämpfer dieses auch
Nothing is impossible. Could it be that the Hamas fighters actually did this? But it is also a fact that we must be very cautious with such claims.
was nicht ist?
So far, there is no confirmed evidence for it. What is not yet, may still become. I am not saying this to absolve Hamas. But we must be very careful. We must not allow our sympathy for the victims to be caught in a propagandistic environment. There is a danger that the emotions of the population will become so heated that in the end, the desire for retaliation becomes overpowering.
Westliche
It is natural that Western politics has unconditionally sided with Israel. This is emotionally understandable, but politically very dangerous. For example, when the German foreign minister says that we are all Israelis as a result of this terrible Hamas attack, it means in plain language that we, the Germans, will intervene again in the event of a larger war and a conflagration in the region. In this case, we would be on Israel's side, similar to what we did before in Ukraine. This would be done with a lot of gut feeling and emotional phase, but with little thought about the possible consequences of our involvement.
Reflexion über die möglichen Folgen des eigenen Engagements. Denn machen wir uns nichts vor, die israelische Regierung ist ja nicht eine, die getragen wurde von...
Let's not fool ourselves. The Israeli government is not made up of humanists or established Democrats who seek compromises in the conflict with the Palestinians. Instead, the policy of the Israeli government is clear. It relies on retaliation. We can already see where this leads when we look at the situation in the Gaza Strip. This cannot be unconditionally condoned. Of course not, because too many people are dying in the Gaza Strip. After 10 days, about 2,700 Palestinians were killed there. 60% of them are women, 25% are children. One has to wonder, if this is supposed to serve the fight against terrorism, where will it lead? We are still in the preparation phase. The Israelis are preparing the Gaza Strip for a ground offensive. It is hard to imagine what will happen then, because thousands of Palestinians will become victims of Israeli retaliation. This cannot be the solution. Terrorism cannot be fought this way. The problem with Hamas, the problem with Palestine, can only be solved politically and diplomatically, not through military violence. Western politics is also hypocritical because the images we have seen from Israel are as terrible and inexcusable as what Hamas has caused there.
Bilder, die wir gesehen haben in Israel, so furchtbar sie sind, so unentschuldbar sie sind, was die Hamas dort angerichtet hat. Es sind ja Bilder, die Menschen aus der arabisch-islamischen Welt sehr vertraut vorkommen. Denken Sie an die Bilder.
These are images that people from the Arab-Islamic world are very familiar with. Think of the images of destruction in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and Syria. All of this is the result of Western interventions in the context of the war on terror. We know the devastation that has caused. Therefore, this strong moral emphasis and bias towards Israel is difficult to convey in the Arab-Islamic world. The people there are accustomed to very different images from their own region. And this has not raised any major doubts among the allies of the USA or led to a condemnation of this war on terror. The accusation of hypocrisy and double standards is in the air. I would like to remind you that Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, sharply criticized the Russian actions in Ukraine. She rightly pointed out that the deliberate and conscious destruction of infrastructure in Ukraine, especially electricity, the interruption of power and water, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, constitutes a war crime. That is also true, but have you ever heard the same woman, von der Leyen, express similar views regarding the Israeli incursion in the Gaza Strip? She was just in Israel, visited the country, and expressed her solidarity.
Sie war gerade in Israel, hat das Land dort besucht, hat ihrer Solidarität Ausdruck verliehen. Das ist ja auch völlig in Ordnung, soll sie tun, selbstverständlich. Unsere Solidarität.
That is perfectly fine. That's how she should act. Of course, our solidarity, as I already said, should be for the civilian victims on both sides. But it would have been a good opportunity for her to repeat her statements about Russian destruction in Ukraine and Israel. She should have urged Israel to exercise restraint. It is completely legitimate for Israel to defend itself against terrorism. However, international legal norms must be respected in the process. The Western states have effectively given the Israeli leadership under Netanyahu a blank check to destroy the Gaza Strip as they please. The statements made by Chancellor Scholz in the parliamentary debate are clear. He unconditionally supports the Israeli government. Whatever the Israeli side demands and needs, whether it's weapons or money, Germany stands by Israel's side. However, this can become problematic if the war escalates and the images from Gaza become so terrible that they overshadow the suffering of the Israeli civilian population. The one-sided support from the West is also problematic because the Arab and Islamic world does not share this perspective, nor does the global South as a whole.
Die islamische Welt diese Sichtweise nicht teilt, der globale Süden insgesamt nicht. Wir haben Massendemonstrationen von Kolumbien bis zu den Philippinen gesehen, in Solidarität mit den Palästinensern und diejenigen,
We have seen mass demonstrations from Colombia to the Philippines showing solidarity with the Palestinians. The hundreds of thousands who demonstrated there are not supporters of Hamas terrorism. However, they are very concerned about the impact of Israeli counter-reactions and violence. If we objectively look at the situation, we must acknowledge that it is absolutely right and legitimate to condemn Palestinian terrorism. However, it is not credible when politicians or opinion makers condemn Palestinian terrorism but say nothing about Israeli state violence. The people in the Palestinian territories have been experiencing one of the longest military occupations in the history of the last and this century since 1967. There is no comparable military occupation that has lasted this long, and it naturally triggers reactions. Pointing this out is not a justification for terrorism, but rather a description of a given situation that we must confront. So let's consider Hamas. What kind of organization is it? How did it come about? And why did it carry out this attack on Israel? What is the background? What is the motive? The simple explanation, of course, is that it all stems from hatred of Jews.
Was ist das Motiv? Die einfache Erklärung ist natürlich, das alles ist Judenhass. Das alles ist der Wunsch, Israel zu zerstören. Das kann man natürlich so sehen, aber diese Sichtweise greift doch ein bisschen.
This is all about the desire to destroy Israel. One can certainly see it that way, but this perspective is somewhat short-sighted. First, it is interesting to remember how Hamas came into existence. Hamas was founded in 1987 during the First Intifada. Interestingly, during its founding phase, Hamas was supported by the Israeli army and Israeli politics. The goal was clear: to weaken the secular PLO under Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat once said that Hamas is a creation of Israel, and he was right. Without Israel's support, Hamas would never have become a mass movement. As mentioned before, the goal was to weaken the secular PLO. Back then, as well as today, there was never a willingness on the Israeli side to find a compromise with the Palestinians in order to achieve a two-state solution. This solution was actually negotiated in the Oslo Accords in 1993. But as we know, the development took a completely different course. When Hamas became too strong and started carrying out attacks in Israel, the tables turned. The Israeli side then began to fight Hamas massively and eliminate its leaders.
Massiv die Hamas zu bekämpfen, ihre Führer zu liquidieren und so weiter und so fort. Aber nichtsdestotrotz, die Hamas ist eine Massenbewegung geworden. Und
despite everything, Hamas has become a mass movement. This has nothing to do with hatred of Jews or the desire to destroy Israel. It is mainly a reaction to an unbearable occupation for the Palestinians. The Palestinians have had to experience that despite all the negotiations they have conducted, they have never received anything from the Israeli side. The Palestinian National Authority based in Ramallah has never experienced any concessions or a reduction in settlement construction. The Palestinian side has always been burdened more and more. As you know, after the Oslo Peace Agreement, Yasser Arafat returned to the Gaza Strip. But that didn't last long. Above all, Ariel Sharon ensured that Yasser Arafat was demonized. In the end, he was besieged in the Muqatta'a, the seat of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. There were elections in Palestine in 2006. In 2005, the Israeli occupiers ended the settlements in the Gaza Strip under Ariel Sharon because it simply wasn't worth it. One must know that the Gaza Strip is a very dry piece of land and it is not possible to carry out large kibbutz-like cultivation there. The land is simply infertile and it was not of interest to the Israeli side to stay there.
Und das war nicht von Interesse für die israelische Seite, dort zu verbleiben. Also ist man aus dem Gazastreifen 2005 abgezogen, um stattdessen den Siedlungskolonialismus.
So in 2005, they withdrew from the Gaza Strip in order to intensify settler colonialism in the West Bank. In 2006, elections were held in the Palestinian territories. In these elections, Hamas won by a large margin in the Gaza Strip. Fatah, the largest faction within the PLO, won in the West Bank. This caused great unrest in Israel and the Western world. Although Hamas had democratically won the elections, the Western states, who often preach democracy, freedom, and human rights, did not want the wrong people to come to power. And so it happened back then. On the initiative of the USA and Israel, Fatah, the PLO based in Ramallah, tried to take control of the Gaza Strip and exclude Hamas. However, they were not successful. In 2007, Hamas expelled the representatives of the Palestinian Authority in a brief war. Since then, there has been a division of the Palestinian territories. The Gaza Strip is under the control of Hamas. The Palestinian Authority based in Ramallah theoretically controls the West Bank. In practice, the West Bank is controlled by the Israeli army and Israeli settlers.
De facto kontrolliert die israelische Armee, kontrollieren die israelischen Siedler das Westjordanland und die palästinensische Autonomiebehörde hat die traurige Aufgabe.
The Palestinian Authority has the unfortunate task of ultimately acting as a supporter of Israeli interests. This is also the reason why the authority is very unpopular among Palestinians. It is perceived as being too accommodating towards the Israeli side. Hamas quickly realized that negotiations with Israel would lead nowhere, especially because Hamas was classified as a terrorist organization from the beginning in the West. There was never a willingness to engage with Hamas in any way. The reason why Hamas has become so strong in the Gaza Strip is related to the living conditions there. The Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. It is the size of the city of Bremen, not the state of Bremen, which also includes Bremerhaven, but only the city of Bremen. People live very closely together there. There are 2.3 million people. They do not have their own economy. For a while, some of them were able to work as cheap labor in Israel, but there was no independent Palestinian economy. More than half of the population in the Gaza Strip depends on support from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. She relies on food aid. The Gaza Strip resembles an open-air prison. When people live there, they can hardly get out. It is very difficult to obtain a travel permit. Although Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005 and the tanks are no longer there, the Gaza Strip remains sealed off from the outside. Therefore, the Gaza Strip is still considered occupied territory under international law. The Israelis have erected a fence, contrary to the Oslo agreements, and practically sealed off the Gaza Strip. The strategy of various Israeli governments was to leave the unwanted Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to their fate in this open-air prison. Over the years, there has been strong resistance to this, to which Israel responded with excessive violence. There have been 5 major Israeli military interventions in the Gaza Strip, all under the pretext of fighting terrorism. About 6,500 people were killed in the process. The longest Israeli attack in the Gaza Strip lasted 51 days. The Israeli side is mistaken if it believes it can solve a political problem with military force. That is not possible. People resist because they do not want to live under the conditions that prevail in the Gaza Strip. Imagine you are a Palestinian in the West Bank and you are 15 or 16 years old. Half of the population there is younger than 20 years old. At 15 or 16 years old, you have already realized that you cannot expect much from life. You do not receive a good education and have no chance of a good life. You cannot develop in any way. You could be the most talented poet in the world or an excellent pianist, but the world will never know. Because you can hardly leave the Gaza Strip. You need the permission of Israel or Egypt for that. Egypt only partially controls the Rafah border crossing. The Israelis have a decisive influence on it and nothing happens there without the approval of the Israeli side. All of this is coordinated between the USA, the Western states in general, and Israel. They believe that it is perfectly fine for the Israeli side to treat the Gaza Strip like this. In the West Bank, we have the problem that the Palestinian Authority there is not very popular. But nobody really challenges them or can challenge them. There have been no elections in the Palestinian territories since 2006.
In den palästinensischen Gebieten. Warum nicht? Weil der Westen und weil Israel die Sorge hat, dass bei wirklich freien Wahlen in den
Why not? The West and Israel are concerned that Hamas would become the strongest party in truly free elections in the Palestinian territories. This also applies to the West Bank. The reason for this is not that the Palestinians are fanatics who want to destroy Israel. Rather, their living conditions are becoming increasingly unbearable. The West Bank suffers greatly from settler colonialism. Often, it is fanatical settlers who forcefully enter Palestinian territory. They conquer entire villages and partially destroy them. Since the beginning of this year, more than 20 Palestinian communities and smaller villages have been destroyed by settlers. Imagine armed settlers, supported by the Israeli army, entering a Palestinian village. This happens constantly in the Hebron area. They drive out the Palestinians who live there from their land and property. If Palestinians resist, they risk being shot. They are seen as terrorists. Or they are arrested and end up in so-called administrative detention. If they are unlucky, this means that the Israeli side can detain them without charge at will for years.
Dass die israelische Seite sie ohne Anklage nach Belieben über Jahre hinweg inhaftieren kann. Ähnlich wie das in Guantanamo der Fall ist.
Similar to Guantanamo, this is the reality of the occupation there. The West Bank has been divided into approximately 250 small enclaves that can hardly communicate with each other. The Israeli side has, so to speak, divided the West Bank into 3 parts. There are separate roads for settlers that only they are allowed to use. If Palestinians use these roads, they risk being shot. These realities are hard to imagine. You also hear relatively little about them in the local media and in politics. For example, if you want to drive from Ramallah, the seat of the Palestinian Authority, to Bethlehem, it is normally a 3/4-hour drive. But the road goes through East Jerusalem, which Palestinians are not allowed to use. You have to take a detour, and there are more than 550 military checkpoints in the West Bank. At each checkpoint, you can be stopped by soldiers. Depending on the mood of the soldier, you may or may not be allowed to continue. If you protest, however, you risk being arrested or shot, as you could be seen as a terrorist.
Verhaftet zu werden oder gleich erschossen zu werden, denn sie sind ja ein Terrorist. Also was sollen sie tun als Palästinenser? Das ist die 3. Generation. Wir haben hier eine Besatzung, die seit 19...
So, what should they as Palestinians do? They are already the 3rd generation. We have an occupation here that has been in place since 1967. It is not just a military occupation. This occupation is connected to an increasing disenfranchisement of the Palestinians. This disenfranchisement is increasingly evident in the fact that even religious cities of the Palestinians are being taken over more and more. This happens gradually, little by little, through a government. In recent years, this government under Prime Minister Netanyahu has been the most right-wing in the history of Israel. The finance minister Smotrich openly identifies himself as a fascist. The Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir, openly and without much opposition in politics speaks of an ethnic cleansing of the West Bank by the Palestinians. He wants to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank. No one knows where they should go then. But that is the strategy. They want to push the Palestinians into ghettos, ideally in large cities, especially in Nablus and Jenin. There they should live in ghetto enclaves, controlled by the Israelis. Any form of resistance is labeled as terrorism and answered with large-scale attacks, without regard for civilians.
Keine Rücksicht auf die Zivilisten genommen wird. Und wenn sie sich in Hebron aufhalten, ja, da wird einem wirklich ganz anders, wenn man dann...
If you find yourself in Hebron, you will notice that there are streets in the old town that are designated only for Jews. As a foreigner and non-Jew, it is okay to use these streets. But if you are a Palestinian and use these streets, you risk being arrested or even losing your life. That is the reality. A few years ago, Sigmar Gabriel, the former foreign minister, described exactly that and called it apartheid. This caused a big outcry and he had to retract his statement. That's how the game goes. If politicians don't stick to the script, they are reprimanded. Gabriel also backtracked. But the situation is truly absurd. Those who have seen or experienced it have no words for it. Today, I saw a video in which Israeli settlers approached Palestinians protesting on the street. One of these Israeli settlers shot a Palestinian in the leg. The Palestinian was lucky that he was only shot in the leg and not in the head. It could have ended differently and nothing would have happened.
Der hätte ihm genauso gut auch in den Kopf schießen können und es wäre nichts passiert. Ja? Also allein in diesen 10 Tagen.
In the first 10 days of the confrontation in the Gaza Strip, about 60 Palestinians were killed. This fact was largely ignored in the local media. Most of these people fell victim to violence by settlers, which goes unpunished. It is important to understand that a large part of the Israeli government consists of right-wing extremists. These people dream of ethnic cleansing. They want to integrate the entire Greater Israel, the entire land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, including the Golan Heights and the Gaza Strip, into their messianic promised land. In this vision, there is no place for Palestinians. The finance minister, Smotrich, who calls himself a fascist, said that Palestinians have 3 options. They can accept their status as stateless individuals under Israeli control, they can emigrate, or they can live with the consequences. By consequences, he means that they will be imprisoned or shot. These are the words of the Israeli finance minister. It is noteworthy that none of the local ministers or politicians have condemned such statements. When Ms. Baerbock or Chancellor Scholz say, "We are all Israelis," it implies that we are also all Mr. Smotrich. But we are not, and we must not be.
Wir sind auch alle Herr Smotrich. Das sind wir aber nicht, das dürfen wir nicht sein. Wir müssen auf der Seite derjenigen Israelis stehen und derjenigen Palästinenser, die sich für eine friedliche Lösung einsetzen und nicht auf.
We must support Israelis and Palestinians who are working towards a peaceful solution. We should not take sides with extremists. However, in Germany, this distinction is often not made. Anyone who criticizes the Israeli occupation risks being accused of anti-Semitism. I do not want to delve further into this topic, but it is important to know that there are networks ready to accuse those who speak out critically and identify Israeli injustices of anti-Semitism. Organizations like Amnesty International or B'Tselem, which have dealt with the situation in the West Bank, are labeled as anti-Israel if they refer to Israeli behavior as apartheid. This is referred to as Israel-related anti-Semitism. This accusation can intimidate anyone. Therefore, it is not conducive to one's career to criticize Israel. It is very difficult to talk about this topic. It is also a tightrope for me. I hope everything goes well because encountering resistance from the guardians of the status quo can be unpleasant.
Auf Gegenwehr stößt von den Bewahrern des Status quo, dann ist das unangenehm. Trotzdem muss man die Dinge beim Namen nennen. Denn,
Nevertheless, we must call things by their name. There can be no military solution to the problem of the Palestinians. It is extremely problematic and dangerous to give the Israeli government under Netanyahu a blank check for an unlimited counterattack against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and possibly also in the West Bank. Now let's come to the question of why Hamas did this. They must have known that there would be reactions and that the situation would become very brutal and bloody. They must also have known that many civilians on the Palestinian side would die. The media and politics here naturally agree that Hamas doesn't care at all. They see Hamas as a terrorist organization that takes the population in the Gaza Strip hostage. They believe that Hamas doesn't care at all if innocent civilians die. They see the responsibility for the death of innocent civilians with Hamas, not with Israel. They see Israel as a country that is known to have the most humane army in the world and would never do anything that could be wrong. But why did Hamas do this? I would like to present to you the findings of the International Crisis Group. This organization is based in Brussels and deals with crisis areas around the world. They have investigated what could have motivated Hamas to carry out this attack.
Bewogen haben, jetzt diesen Angriff durchzuführen, und deren Analyse ist die folgende. Die Angriffe der Hamas.
The analysis is as follows. The attacks by Hamas seem to be a desperate attempt to bring about a change in the current status quo. They want to end the 17-year-long siege of the Gaza Strip, which has made the Gaza Strip essentially uninhabitable. The Israeli side has responded with massive bombardments, including in civilian areas. They have imposed boycott measures and closed border crossings. As a result, no water or electricity is allowed to enter the occupied areas, the Gaza Strip. This is a form of collective punishment that can trigger a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The International Crisis Group has referred to this as an attempt at a breakthrough to end the 17-year-long siege of the Gaza Strip. There is also another comment on this question. Why did Hamas do this? A commentator on Al Jazeera said that it is not appropriate to compare Hamas attacks on Israel to 9/11. Instead, they should be seen as a prison uprising. The inmates of the prison are signaling that they are no longer willing to live under these conditions.
Die Gefängnisinsassen signalisieren, wir sind nicht länger bereit, unter diesen Bedingungen unser Leben zu fristen. Wir wissen, dass wir einen furchtbaren Preis bezahlen werden, aber wir wissen genauso gut, dass wir keine Zukunft haben in diesem.
We know that we will pay a high price, but we also know that we have no future in the Gaza Strip. According to the United Nations, this strip has been uninhabitable since last year, 2022. The soil is completely dried out and there is not enough drinking water. The available drinking water is often salty. Israel controls the supply of the residents of the Gaza Strip in all areas. They provide them with food and everything they need. But this control has terrible consequences for the civilian population. That is why Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has said that the situation in the Gaza Strip is on the verge of a catastrophe. And this applies not only to the Gaza Strip, but to the entire region. So we have to consider that the situation is not as simple as some people here think. It is interesting to see that smart Israelis, who usually do not support the Netanyahu government, have a more differentiated opinion. I would like to quote here the former Minister of Foreign Defense, historian, and diplomat Shlomo Ben Ami. He said the following about the current situation in the region.
Auf das, was jetzt passiert in der Region, Folgendes unter anderem festgehalten hat. Von Clausewitz haben wir gelernt, dass ein Krieg im Zusammenhang mit einem politischen Ziel
From Clausewitz, we have learned that a war should be connected to a political goal. Therefore, anyone who fights a war without a political goal cannot actually win that war. The current war being fought by Hamas does have such a goal. This goal is to secure their hegemony within the Palestinian national movement against Fatah and the PLO. Hamas wants to achieve the liberation of their men from Israeli prisons through the exchange of hostages. They also want to prevent Palestine's fate from being sacrificed by the Arab brothers who are hastily normalizing their relations with the Jewish state. However, for the Netanyahu government, it is purely a reactive war. The political goal is only to achieve a pause until the next round of hostilities. This is what former Foreign Defense Minister Shlomo Ben Ami says. I find it remarkable that he is capable of such a differentiated judgment in the situation Israel finds itself in. So, it is not the case that Hamas attacked Israel out of blind fanaticism or hatred of Jews. There is a political strategy behind it. The fact that more than 1,000 Israelis, many of them civilians, have been killed is inexcusable. There is nothing to justify in this Israeli assault on Israeli civilians.
Es gibt nichts gut zu heißen an diesem israelischen Überfall auf israelische Zivilisten. Es ist aber trotzdem auch wichtig, dass man nicht jede propagandistische Überhöhung glaubt.
However, it is also important not to believe every propagandistic exaggeration. For example, that children in Kyrgyzstan had their heads cut off or women were raped. Nothing is impossible, but so far there is no evidence for that. This should always be kept in mind, because such claims can legitimize wars. That is the goal of such statements. Do you remember the famous incubator lie from 1990? At that time, Iraqi soldiers were accused of taking babies out of their incubators in Kuwait. The person who reported this in tears in the American Congress claimed to be a Kuwaiti nurse and had seen it with her own eyes. Everyone in Congress was shocked, and it was clear that we would liberate Kuwait against Saddam Hussein. However, It later turned out that this person was not a nurse, but the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington. That was very good public relations, you have to say. That's why you should always be cautious, despite all the emotion and solidarity with the victims, whether in Israel or Palestine. One should not let oneself be instrumentalized by the big simplifiers. Now to the question, what happens next? I would like to add that earlier I said Yasser Arafat referred to Hamas as a creation of Israel.
Die Hamas als eine Kreatur Israels bezeichnet hat, nämlich mit dem Ziel, die PLO als Nationalbewegung zu schwächen.
The goal was to weaken the PLO as a national movement. Netanyahu has also made statements that the existence of Hamas is a guarantee for Israel that there will be no Palestinian state. The negative image of Hamas in the West could not be more negative. This terrorist organization, which wants to destroy Israel, cannot be included in a political dialogue. This creates a nice factor for demonization. One cannot expect Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, to negotiate with such terrorists. This has created an ideal situation to undermine the peace process, if there ever was one. Since 1967, since the beginning of the Israeli occupation, the Palestinians have been constantly deceived and have never gotten what they wanted, namely their own state. There has been a lot of talk and negotiation, but in reality, one settlement after another has been built on the Israeli side in the West Bank. Each of these settlements is against international law. The West Bank is divided into at least two parts, north and south. The settlements are strategically designed to divide the territory of the West Bank, so that there can never be a two-state solution in practice.
Sodass es eine Zwei-Staaten-Lösung de facto niemals mehr geben kann.
It is impossible. It is impossible. So, what happens now? The Israelis have heavily bombed the north and set a 24-hour deadline, which was then extended. They demand that people in the northern Gaza Strip move south. There are 1.1 million people involved. The Gaza Strip is only as big as Bremen. Imagine that 1.1 million people are supposed to go south. But there is nothing there. There is no infrastructure. And of course, the Israelis bomb everything. They show no consideration, not even for hospitals. They argue as a standard that terrorists are hiding everywhere. So why are the Israelis exerting this pressure from north to south? I think one of the reasons, not the only one, is that they want to drive as many Palestinians as possible towards the Egyptian border crossing in Rafah. The Palestinians' distress will become so great that Western countries will demand that Egypt allow aid for the poor Palestinians to pass through. Out of solidarity from person to person, one must help. However, the problem for Egypt is if they open the border and let the Palestinians into the Sinai.
Glaubt irgendjemand ernsthaft, dass die Israelis jemals diese Palästinenser, die dann in Richtung...
Does anyone seriously believe that the Israelis will ever allow the Palestinians who emigrated to Egypt to return to the Gaza Strip? Of course not. This is also known in Egypt. That's why Egypt doesn't want to fall into this trap. They don't want the Palestinians to be pushed over the border into Egypt by Israel, as if with a bulldozer. Then Egypt would have to deal with these Palestinians. It is a bitter irony of history that most of the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip are descendants of Palestinians. They were expelled from the areas in southern Israel during the establishment of the Israeli state in 1947-48. It was in these areas that the Hamas attack later took place. This irony shows that the trauma of displacement is still present, especially because the Palestinians do not see any perspective for themselves. In Israel, there has never been a real confrontation with what I would call the original sin of the founding of the state. This was accompanied by the deliberate, intentional, and systematic expulsion of about 800,000 Palestinians. That was about 3/4 of the Palestinian population at the time. They were expelled to neighboring countries.
Die vertrieben wurden in die Nachbarländer. Ja? Und das ist ein weitgehendes Tabu. Es gibt einige wenige Historiker, die sich damit...
And this is a widely spread taboo. There are only a few historians who have dealt with this Nakba catastrophe. This is what the Palestinians and Arabs call this event, but the majority of society ignores it and refers to the Holocaust. They say that it may be true that the situation for the Palestinians was not good, but we have suffered more. So it's okay. So what happens next? What is happening now in the Gaza Strip? There is no question that the Israeli ground offensive will begin. It is only a matter of time. Not all troops are there yet, but maybe the Israelis are already in the Gaza Strip when this podcast goes online. There will be a terrible massacre. Thousands of people will die. And this will have enormous implications for the perception of Israel in the Arab Islamic world. It is feared that opinions in this conflict, as in the Ukraine war, will be divided. Western states have a clear opinion on Ukraine and Israel and do not deviate from it, no matter how brutal the situation may be. It is always said that Israel has the right to defend itself, which is undisputed. But don't the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? What can they do to resist the Israeli occupation, which is accepted by the West? That is just a question. In short, if we see terrible images from the Gaza Strip, the mood could also shift in the Western world. What Hamas has done in Israel is terrible and a crime. But if this crime is surpassed by what the Israelis do in the Gaza Strip, the mood could also shift in the Western world. Our media will ensure that the prevailing opinion goes in the right direction. But there is a difference between public opinion and published opinion. This could also become a problem for us. But it will primarily become a problem in the global South. As I said before, there are large demonstrations from Colombia to the Philippines supporting the Palestinians, which is hardly mentioned in our media.
Philippinen große Demonstrationen zugunsten der Palästinenser, was in den hiesigen Medien kaum vorkommt, ist klar. Aber nichtsdestotrotz.
Nevertheless, they exist and the atmosphere is very tense. One must always bear in mind that the Arab states and their leaders have long abandoned the Palestine issue. They strive for a normalization of relations with Israel in order to build good relations with the USA in this way. The so-called Abraham Accords, which were adopted between various Arab countries such as Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan in the years 2020 and 2021, are peace agreements with Israel. Originally, Saudi Arabia was also supposed to be included in these agreements. This is no longer the case. The issue is off the table. Saudi Arabia does want to approach Israel, but given the expected images from the Gaza Strip, the local ruler Mohammed bin Salman cannot implement this. His own population would not accept it, and the rulers on site are naturally afraid for their legitimacy. There are great fears, as mentioned before, in Egypt that the Israelis could expel the Palestinians to Egypt. There are also great fears in Jordan that, if the crisis escalates, the Israelis could try to create a situation in the West Bank where they could deport a large number of Palestinians to Jordan.
Schon seit den späten 1970er Jahren.
Since the late 1970s, there has been a belief among ultra-conservative and right-wing groups in Israel that no further Palestinian state is needed. They argue that there is already a Palestinian state, namely Jordan. They point out that 60% of the population in Jordan consists of Palestinians. Therefore, they propose making Jordan a Palestinian state. In Israel, this idea is spread with the slogan, Palestine is Jordan, and has some supporters. However, Jordan has a peace treaty with Israel and the king of the country is very pro-Western. This does not make the situation for Israel so simple. But there is the question of whether the Western community of values would not stand on Israel's side if the worst were to happen. This could mean the expulsion of Palestinians in large numbers towards Jordan or Egypt. The great danger is that the conflict could escalate very quickly. Hezbollah and Iran have already made it clear that they will not accept excessive use of force by Israel. Hezbollah, also known as the Party of God and supported by Iran, is very well organized. They are estimated to have 150,000 highly accurate rockets. In contrast, Hamas rockets are not very accurate.
Raketen der Hamas sind nicht sehr genau. Sie können zwar in Richtung Ashdod oder in Richtung israelischer Städte Raketen abfeuern, aber ob die dann tatsächlich...
You can indeed launch rockets towards Ashdod or Israeli cities, but whether they actually fly where they are supposed to is basically a matter of luck. The rockets that Hezbollah has in southern Lebanon can be adjusted to the square centimeter. If a major war breaks out, Israel will try to clean up from Beirut to Gaza with support from Washington and eliminate terrorism. But if that happens, not only thousands of Palestinians, Arabs, and Lebanese will die, but also thousands of Israelis. Places like Tel Aviv, Haifa, and West Jerusalem will come under attack. No place in Israel will be safe then. The West will stand fully behind Israel, but it is a mistake to believe that a nuclear power like Israel could necessarily defeat guerrilla forces like Hezbollah or Hamas. These groups have the support of large parts of their own population. There could be devastating destruction, but think of the Taliban in Afghanistan. NATO fought against the Taliban for 20 years, and in the end, the Taliban defeated NATO. I wouldn't bet that the Israeli army could end this war so easily. The media and politics here not only blame Hamas for the attack on Israel, but above all Iran. However, there is no evidence that Iran is behind this attack. There are many speculations. It is clear that there is a political alliance between the two. But there is no evidence to support the claims that Iran encouraged this attack. One must be very cautious with such statements, as they serve to legitimize a possible war against Iran. Do you remember the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq and Saddam Hussein allegedly possessed? The USA and Great Britain waged an illegal war of aggression against Iraq to protect the world from these weapons.
Koalition der Willigen einen völkerrechtswidrigen Angriffskrieg gegen den Irak geführt haben, die Welt zu schützen vor diesen Bösen. Ja, die hat es aber nicht.
However, there were never these weapons of mass destruction. These weapons of mass destruction. They were a propagandistic invention by those who wanted this war, with the aim of overthrowing Saddam Hussein. Of course, the USA, Israel, and possibly also Arab states want the Mullah regime to be overthrown. But no one should make the mistake of believing that this is possible. We are not used to thinking politically and analytically. We are not used to thinking geopolitically. There is this narrative that the population in Iran is just waiting to overthrow this regime. That is a mistake. One must assume that there is still enough support in Iran for this regime. And we must not forget that Iran has two very good friends, both economically and militarily and politically, China and Russia. If Israel or the USA were to attack Iran, then the Middle East would explode. And what would happen then would make the war in Ukraine appear like a harmless skirmish. I say this deliberately. Then the region of the Middle East would go up in flames. Nothing would be safe anymore. Which regimes would survive and which would not? Nobody knows that. Allahu Akbar. God knows best. Nobody knows that. Then anything could happen. Really anything could happen. Then, if I may say so, everything would be open. And no one can predict what will happen then. This could even lead to a third world war. You can't seriously believe that China and Russia will abandon Iran. They will provide Tehran with any possible support. They may do this discreetly, but they will do everything in their power to ensure that their close ally in Tehran remains in power. To believe otherwise would be naive. And where all of this can lead, one really doesn't want to imagine. It would also be economically devastating. What do you think will happen to energy prices, to oil and gas, to prices on the world market if there is a war in the region? In Germany, we already have massive problems. The German economy has massive problems because of the sanctions against Russia. I have talked about this in other podcasts. If another oil price shock is added now and prices continue to rise, then the local economy will be significantly shaken. But our political representatives do not consider all of this. They say we are all Israelis. They do not think beyond the day. They act impulsively, without reason or understanding. It is not necessary for the federal government to say that in doubt, we will provide the Israelis with everything they need, including weapons.
Als ob es Israel an Waffen fehlen würde, als ob es in der Region an Waffen fehlen würde. Ja? Das Problem ist nicht militärisch zu lösen.
It's not that Israel lacks weapons or that the region lacks weapons. The problem cannot be solved militarily. The core of the problem is the unresolved Palestine issue. The conflict shows that Western states, who often speak of freedom, democracy, and human rights, reveal their hypocrisy in the context of Israel and Palestine. They support a state that has been engaged in settlement colonialism since 1967. For 2 generations, Palestinians have known nothing but the reality of occupation. Palestinians have also inflicted much suffering on other Palestinians. But there is a David and a Goliath here. Israel is the strongest military power in the vast area between the Atlantic in the west and India in the east. Israel does not need further arms deliveries from Germany or elsewhere, but a political solution. One should critically question the German government and the European Union why they have done nothing in the past decades to counter Israeli occupation. They should clearly signal to the respective Israeli government that they do not accept the only democracy in the Middle East acting as a colonial occupying power. This is condemned as apartheid by various institutions. Those who say this are often labeled as anti-Semitic, but this cannot continue. The region does not need more weapons, but diplomacy, political finesse, and a willingness to negotiate. However, this willingness is lacking among the Western supporters of Israel. They tend to demonize the Palestinian side and mentally prepare for further destruction in Lebanon and possibly a war against Iran. This could easily lead to a massive confrontation between NATO and China and Russia. These are not pleasant prospects, but I suspect that our decision makers are not thinking in this direction. If a political decision maker were to think in a more balanced direction, I'm not sure if it would really benefit their career. Finally, I would like to point out the upcoming domestic upheavals.
Abschließend möchte ich verweisen auf die innenpolitischen Verwerfungen, die uns ins Haus stehen. Es ist ja so, es darf eines nicht geben. In den westlichen Ländern und auch nicht in Deutschland natürlich eine kritische.
It is the case that in Western countries, including Germany, there must not be any critical engagement with Israeli settler colonialism. A critical examination of the Nakba or the Israeli seizure of Palestinian land is also not allowed. The injustice suffered by the Palestinians must not be addressed. To prevent this, there are a number of measures in place. These could already be observed, for example, in May in Berlin, in connection with the founding of the Israeli state. On May 14th, various Palestinian demonstrations were supposed to take place. They were meant to commemorate the Nakba, the catastrophe. This catastrophe refers to the expulsion of 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians. But all of these demonstrations were banned in Berlin. Why actually? The argument was that potentially anti-Semitic slogans could be shouted. For this reason, they were prohibited. This decision is highly questionable from a democratic perspective. If I could assume based on a suspicion that something inappropriate might be said, I could basically ban any demonstration. Because I can always assume that there are people who want to protest against the alleged reform of the healthcare system. There may be Putin sympathizers among the protesters. That is a risk we cannot take. If I want to, I can expand on this topic extensively. This is currently happening with the Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. They have no way of making their voice heard. If you are currently seen in Berlin Neukölln with a kofi, which is a Palestinian scarf, or a Palestinian flag on the street, you should expect the police to stop you and ask you to remove it. There may come a time when carrying a Palestinian flag is classified as unconstitutional, similar to the use of the letter Z in public space. He wanted to rule this out. Therefore, there should be no critical examination of Palestinian history and the injustice suffered by the Palestinians, because this contradicts the Israeli narrative. This narrative states that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and that it wants to live in peace, democracy, and freedom with the Palestinians. But on the Palestinian side, there are only terrorists, and you cannot make peace with them, as the recent events of the Hamas attack have once again shown. Therefore, an alternative narrative must be offered, which goes something like this.
Der fanatische Islam unter den Migranten, der notorische Antisemitismus, der bei denen anzutreten.
The fanatical Islam among migrants and the widespread anti-Semitism poisoned the situation in Germany and worldwide. It is this deep hatred of Jews that drives Palestinians to take to the streets and celebrate what Hamas has done. I have tried to explain, without justifying it, why Hamas carried out this attack. They wanted to escape their terrible situation. That is why some Palestinians in the diaspora expressed their joy. They saw it as an attempt to change the unbearable conditions in the Palestinian territories. Whether it was wise to cheer or not is another question. But you cannot constantly dictate to people what they should think, feel, or experience. It is not possible to constantly tell Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims in this country that their historical experiences do not matter. Most Palestinians living in Berlin or Germany have family stories of flight and displacement. But no one wants to hear these stories in the public context in Germany. Look at the talk shows reporting on the war in the Middle East. Have you ever heard Palestinian voices there conveying the Palestinian perspective? That is not desired. Therefore, we must beware of an Islam that has made hatred of Jews its program. The result is that peaceful coexistence is no longer possible. Therefore, there is a political proposal to revoke the citizenship of Palestinians who show sympathy for Hamas. This is an absurd and thoughtless proposal. Legally speaking, how can you revoke people's citizenship? And even if you did and said, "You Palestinian who is against the Israeli occupation, we are deporting you," where should they go then? The Palestinian refugee camps are located in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Gaza Strip. But where should they be deported to? It is not possible, even if one wanted to. But the politicians in question, of course, do not think that far. We know from German history how difficult it is when you ignore the experiences of East Germans and signal to them that everything they experienced in the GDR is worthless. This is one of the reasons why the AfD has become very strong in East Germany.
Das kommt nicht gut. Das ist einer der Gründe, warum die AfD sehr, sehr stark geworden ist in Ostdeutschland. Ja, wenn wir jetzt den Palästinensern, den Arabern, den Muslimen ständig signalisieren, ihr seid doch alles potenzielle Terroristen und Hamas-Sympathisanten.
If we constantly signal to the Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims that they are potential terrorists and Hamas sympathizers, there will be consequences. If we ignore their perspective on the conflict because it does not align with ours, and we do not accept their opinion, what will happen then? Some of them may go underground if the situation escalates. Do we really want violence on our streets? This violence could bring other groups to the streets, such as right-wing extremists who want to drive out foreigners. Can we really imagine that? It is dangerous to go in this direction. Finally, I would like to address the accusation of anti-Semitism. This accusation comes from the Arab and Muslim side and is felt by the politics, the media, and partly also by Jewish representatives in this country. I would like to address the accusation that there is Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. This is directed against Jews and makes it almost impossible for Arabs and Muslims to live in Germany and Europe. This is especially true if they do not fully adopt the local perspective. For example, regarding the conflict in Israel and Palestine.
Sichtweise vollständig übernehmen, etwa mit Blick auf den Konflikt in Israel und Palästina. Historisch gesehen ist es so, dass Antisemitismus bis hin zu Pogromen, bis hin
Historically, anti-Semitism, which led to pogroms in Auschwitz, was a phenomenon of Christian-influenced Europe. The pogroms we witnessed in the Middle Ages, up to the Nazi mass extermination sites, are all European phenomena. Where did the Jews flee when they were expelled from Spain and Portugal by the Inquisition in 1492? Most of them emigrated to North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. They would not have done so if they had feared being persecuted for anti-Semitism there. The tensions between Jews and Arabs actually increased only with the establishment of the Israeli state in 1947-48. This happened in the course of the systematic expulsion of a large number of Palestinians and deteriorating relations. There was often criticism of Israel and anger towards Israel, which is frequently identified as anti-Semitism in the Western world. This fits the narrative. Criticism of Israel is often seen as Israel-related anti-Semitism, and from there it is only a short step to hatred of Jews. Such simplifications are not helpful. It should be made clear once again that there are many Jewish voices advocating for peace and reconciliation with the Palestinians.
Die sich für einen Frieden und für einen Ausgleich mit den Palästinensern einsetzen. Und die Diskussion, wenn man sie dann so nennen will, in Deutschland.
The discussion in Germany and Austria is certainly the most difficult. Here, any criticism of Israel is suspected of being anti-Semitic. However, in the USA, Great Britain, and even in Israel itself, the perception is more differentiated. I have quoted a former minister who confirms this. We need to find a new way to deal with each other. It should be possible to criticize the policies of Israel objectively without being accused of anti-Semitism. German politics should learn not to always act impulsively. This became clear in the case of the Ukraine war, which had significant consequences for the local economy. Now, with the increasing conflicts in the Middle East, the pattern is repeating itself. The consequences do not seem to be considered. I fear that any attempt to promote a differentiated perception will largely fall on deaf ears. Nevertheless, it is urgently necessary to do so. We will not make progress if we take sides unilaterally. We must do justice to both sides, to the peaceful parts of Palestinian and Israeli society. Otherwise, we are only pouring more oil on the fire.
Mehr Öl ins Feuer. Aber ich weiß ganz genau, dass dieses nicht der Weg ist, der beschritten werden wird, sollte es zum Äußersten kommen.
But I am sure that this is not the path we will take. When extreme situations arise in the Middle East, Germany will once again be at the forefront. The Hofreiters and Strack-Zimmermans will ensure that we do not deviate from the right path in Germany, with all the resulting consequences. Mr. Dam, thank you for your attention. That was a journey through contemporary history, one could say. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize once again that my sympathy and solidarity are with all those who suffer and will continue to suffer innocently on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides. I am aware that one can see things very differently from how I do here. I invite anyone who officially believes that my statements are outrageous to engage in an open discourse based on facts. Why should it not be possible to discuss difficult questions in a constructive manner, in the interest of the people in the region, but also in the interest of peaceful coexistence of all people, regardless of their origin or religious orientation, here in our own country, in Germany? With that in mind, I thank you for your attention, wish you all the best, and until next time.
In Deutschland. In diesem Sinne danke ich für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Alles Gute, machen Sie es gut. Bis zum nächsten Mal.